My name is Camille Taylor. I'm 39, and I was standing at my mother's funeral in rural Vermont, bracing myself for the moment my sister would walk in. The same sister who married the man who ghosted me without warning 7 years ago. They thought they had buried me under the weight of betrayal and silence. But they didn't know who I brought with me that day. Before I tell you what made her face turn white in front of everyone, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I read every one. Have you ever felt the sting of betrayal, not from strangers, but from the very people who were meant to shield you, love you, stand in front of you when the world got cruel, but instead, they stepped aside and let it hurt you? The kind of betrayal that doesn't just break your heart, but shatters your entire world, leaving you to pick up pieces you didn't even realize were essential until they were gone? My life, before the storm, felt like a meticulously crafted painting, each brushstroke a testament to careful planning and a quiet joy. I remember Saturday mornings in my New York apartment, the city's hum a distant lullaby. The scent of freshly brewed coffee would intertwine with the subtle aroma of cinnamon and vanilla, a ritual that always marked the beginning of a perfect weekend. Damien would be in the kitchen, his tall frame leaning against the counter, meticulously grinding beans. He was a creature of habit, and I found comfort in his predictable movements, the way his dark hair would fall across his forehead as he concentrated. We had matching ceramic mugs, chipped slightly from years of shared mornings, filled with coffee just the way we liked it, strong, black, and hot enough to burn the tongue if you weren't careful. Our apartment, on the 11th floor, overlooked a stretch of the Hudson River. In the mornings, the light would stream in, painting gold onto the worn Persian rug in the living room. It was a space we had built together, piece by piece, not with grand gestures, but with small, thoughtful additions. The overflowing bookshelf in the corner, a testament to our shared love for forgotten classics and obscure poetry. The mismatched throw pillows on the sofa, each picked for its texture or color, creating a patchwork of comfort. The tiny herb garden on the windowsill, a brave attempt at bringing a piece of nature into our urban sanctuary. Dinners were often a quiet affair. We weren't big on lavish meals, preferring the intimacy of simple dishes cooked together. I would chop vegetables, the rhythmic thud of the knife against the cutting board a soothing soundtrack. Damien would hum along to some jazz music, his voice a low rumble. Sometimes, we'd talk about our day, the small triumphs and minor frustrations of our respective jobs. Other times, we'd simply exist in comfortable silence, the clinking of silverware against ceramic plates the only interruption. I remember one evening, a cool autumn breeze drifting through the open window, carrying the scent of rain. We were eating pasta, a simple aglio e olio, and Damien reached across the table, his fingers gently tracing the lines on my palm. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "I can't imagine a day without this." His words, so simple, felt like a promise etched into the very fabric of our lives. Our shared routines were the backbone of our existence. Evening walks along the river, hand in hand, watching the city lights flicker to life. Trips to the local farmers market on Sundays, our canvas bags overflowing with ripe berries and crusty bread. Lazy afternoons spent curled on the sofa, reading separate books, but sharing the same quiet space. These weren't grand adventures, they were the small, mundane moments that, when strung together, formed the beautiful tapestry of our life. We had plans, of course. Big plans. A small cottage upstate, away from the relentless pulse of the city. A dog, a golden retriever with a goofy grin. Children, their laughter echoing through sun-drenched rooms. These weren't just dreams. They were blueprints, meticulously discussed and lovingly detailed. We had even picked out names. Eleanor, if it was a girl, after my grandmother. Thomas, if it was a boy, after Damien's grandfather. My sister, Melanie, was a frequent, though sometimes unsettling, presence in our lives. She was 2 years younger than me, but always seemed a step ahead in her ambitions, her desires. She was the one who always knew the right people, wore the right clothes, said the right things. I loved her, of course. She was my sister, my only sibling. But there was always a faint shadow of competition, a subtle undercurrent of envy beneath her effusive displays of affection. She'd visit often, bringing a whirlwind of designer bags and stories of exclusive parties. She'd sit at our dinner table, admiring Damien's cooking, complimenting the apartment, sometimes a little too eagerly. "Camille, you've really built something special here," she'd say, her eyes lingering on Damien for just a beat too long. I dismissed it, of course. Sisters are like that. A little competitive, a little envious, but ultimately, they want the best for you. Don't they? I remember a specific evening. Melanie had come over for dinner. Damien had made his famous roasted chicken, and the apartment was filled with the warm, comforting scent. Melanie, dressed impeccably as always, was regaling us with a story about a new gallery opening she had attended. She was animated, her hands gesturing wildly, and Damien was listening, a polite smile on his face. At one point, her hand brushed against his arm as she leaned forward to emphasize a point. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, but a tiny shiver, like a cold draft, ran down my spine. I pushed it away. It was just Melanie. She was effusive, tactile. It meant nothing. We talked about our upcoming wedding, the plans slowly taking shape. The small, intimate ceremony we envisioned, surrounded by close friends and family. Melanie had offered to help, of course, with a little too much enthusiasm. "Oh, Camille, you absolutely must let me help with the dress. I know the most incredible boutique." I had smiled, grateful for her offer, even as a small part of me wondered if her eagerness was truly about helping or about inserting herself into the narrative. I told myself it was just sisterly affection, a desire to be part of my happiness. I had no reason to doubt her. The painting was still perfect, the colors vibrant, the lines clean. The storm was still a distant whisper on the horizon, too faint to be heard over the comfortable hum of my perfectly constructed life. The first cracks in the meticulously painted canvas of my life were subtle, almost imperceptible. Like hairline fractures in a priceless vase, you had to look closely, tilt it just so, for the light to catch them. It started with Damien. Small things at first. A forgotten promise, like the Sunday morning brunch we always shared, replaced by a vague excuse about an urgent work call. He started staying later at the office, the late-night calls from his supposed colleagues becoming more frequent, their hushed tones a new, unsettling melody in our quiet apartment. He'd come home tired, distant, his eyes shadowed. When I'd ask if everything was all right, he'd offer a tight smile and a mumbled assurance of stress, of deadlines, of the relentless grind of his industry. And I believed him. Or rather, I wanted to believe him. The alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. Then there were the texts. Ambiguous messages that would flash across his phone screen, quickly dismissed or deleted before I could glimpse more than a fleeting string of emojis or a single, enigmatic word. A forgotten phone on the counter, buzzing with a notification from an unsaved number. A quick glance, just a flash of a name, something like ML or Mel. My heart would give a strange little lurch, a skip in its rhythm that felt like a premonition. I'd rationalize it, of course. Clients, colleagues, business contacts. Damien was a busy man. It was foolish to be so suspicious. But the unease lingered, a bitter aftertaste in my mouth. Melanie's behavior also began to shift, subtly at first, then more overtly. She was always around, it seemed, more than usual. Dropping by unannounced, ostensibly to see me, but her gaze would always gravitate towards Damien. She'd bring him small, thoughtful gifts, a rare coffee blend, a book by an author he admired, always with a dismissive wave of her hand when I'd thank her. "Oh, it's nothing, just saw it and thought of him." Her eyes, when she looked at me, seemed to hold a new glint, a peculiar mix of pity and triumph that I couldn't quite decipher. It made my skin crawl. One evening, we were at a small gallery opening, an event Damien had insisted we attend. He was talking to a colleague, his back to me, and Melanie was standing beside me, her arm linked through mine, a picture of sisterly affection. Then I saw it. Damien glanced over his shoulder, his eyes meeting Melanie's across the crowded room. It was a brief look, no more than a second, but it held a depth, a silent understanding that chilled me to the bone. Melanie's smile, a secret, knowing curve of her lips, was a dagger to my gut. She quickly averted her gaze, turning to me with a bright, innocent smile. "Isn't this artwork just fascinating, Camille?" she chirped, as if nothing had happened. I felt a wave of nausea. The subtle changes began to escalate. Damien grew more irritable, more withdrawn. Our evening walks along the river became less frequent, replaced by his need to clear his head alone. The easy laughter that once filled our apartment was replaced by a heavy silence, punctuated only by the clinking of ice in his glass as he nursed a late-night drink. He stopped touching me. Not in an angry way, just avoid. The casual touch of his hand on my back as I walked past, the gentle squeeze of my hand during a movie, the comforting brush of his arm against mine on the sofa. All gone. I would lie awake at night, the silence of the bedroom deafening, listening to his even breathing beside me, a chasm growing between us even as we shared the same bed. My mind would race, playing and replaying every odd look, every hushed phone call, every ambiguous text. I started to question everything. Was it me? Had I done something wrong? Was I not enough? The insidious tendrils of self-doubt began to choke me, stealing my breath, leaving me gasping for air in a world that was suddenly turning alien. I started observing them, covertly, like a detective in my own life. I noticed the way Melanie's perfume lingered on Damien's clothes sometimes, a scent that was distinctly hers, not mine. I saw the way his eyes would track her movements across a room, a subtle possessiveness in his gaze that he never directed at me anymore. I overheard snippets of hushed conversations, quickly cut short when I entered the room. "We can't talk about this now," Damien would say, his voice tight. Melanie would offer a saccharine smile and change the subject too quickly, too smoothly. The unease was a constant companion now, a knot in my stomach that tightened with every passing day. I tried to talk to Damien, to voice my growing fears. "Is everything all right between us?" I'd ask, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. He'd sigh, run a hand through his hair, and say, "Camille, you're imagining things. You're stressed about the wedding, about work. Everything's fine." His words were hollow, echoing in the cavern of my doubt. I wanted to believe him, desperately. I clung to the hope that I was just being paranoid, that my imagination was running wild. But the gut feeling, that primal instinct that screams when something is terribly wrong, refused to be silenced. It was a low thrum beneath the surface, a constant reminder that the ground beneath my feet was no longer solid, but crumbling slowly, inexorably, into an abyss I couldn't yet see. The storm was no longer a whisper. It was a distant roar, growing louder with every beat of my terrified heart. The air in the apartment felt thick, heavy with unspoken words, and the cloying scent of lilies. Melanie had brought them over, a just-because gesture that now felt like a cruel joke. I was standing in the kitchen, mindlessly wiping down the already clean counter, the dull ache in my chest a constant companion. Damien had been distant for weeks, his absences growing longer, his excuses thinner. The suspicion, once a tiny seed, had blossomed into a thorny vine, choking out all joy, all peace. My fingers trembled as I picked up his phone from where he'd carelessly left it on the charger. He was in the shower, the sound of the water a rhythmic backdrop to my pounding heart. I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that what I was about to do was a line I shouldn't cross. But the need, the desperate, clawing need for answers, was stronger than any moral qualm. I navigated to his messages, my breath catching in my throat. The first few were mundane work emails, then texts from friends. And then, there it was. A conversation thread, long and sprawling, with Melanie. My sister. My vision blurred. I scrolled, my thumbs feeling numb, each word a fresh wound. "Can't wait to see you tonight, my love. Missing you already." She's starting to suspect. "Don't worry, we'll figure it out." She's too naive. The words swam before my eyes, twisting into grotesque shapes. It wasn't just a flirtation. It was a secret life, meticulously crafted behind my back, a betrayal so deep, so insidious, it felt like my very bones were dissolving. My sister. My fiancé. The two people I had trusted most in this world, weaving a tapestry of lies and deceit around me. The realization hit me like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. I leaned against the cold countertop, my legs suddenly weak, the room spinning around me. The sound of the shower stopped. Panic flared. I quickly put the phone back, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. He emerged from the bathroom moments later, a towel wrapped around his waist, water droplets clinging to his eyelashes. He smiled, a lazy, unconcerned smile, and my stomach churned. He looked at me, really looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw nothing but indifference. "Everything okay, Cam?" he asked, his voice casual. The normalcy of it, the sheer audacity, was suffocating. I couldn't speak. The words were lodged in my throat, a bitter, metallic taste. I just shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. He seemed to notice my distress then, his brow furrowing slightly. "What's wrong?" he asked, a hint of impatience in his tone. I finally managed to speak, my voice a raw whisper, barely audible. "I know." His face, usually so composed, went utterly blank. For a fleeting second, a flicker of fear, or perhaps guilt, crossed his eyes before being replaced by a chilling impassivity. "Know what, Camille?" he said, his voice flat. I swallowed, the taste of ash in my mouth. "About you and Melanie. Everything." He didn't deny it. He didn't try to explain. He just stood there, the water still dripping from his hair, the silence screaming between us. Then he simply sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "Look, Camille," he began, his voice devoid of emotion. "It wasn't planned. These things, they happen." He paused, looking away, then back at me, his eyes cold. "Melanie and I, we have a connection. Something different. Something you and I never had." His words, so casually delivered, were daggers, each one twisting deeper into my already bleeding heart. The ground beneath me gave way. The world tilted, then spun, then shattered into a million irreparable pieces. This wasn't just a breakup, it was the demolition of my entire reality. The comfortable apartment, the shared routines, the future we had so meticulously planned, all reduced to rubble in an instant. I felt a profound, bone-deep weariness settle over me. There was no anger, no screaming, no dramatic outburst. Just a quiet, desolate emptiness. The grief was so immense, it manifested as a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it impossible to breathe. My mind raced, not with fury, but with a horrifying clarity. Every subtle shift, every uneasy feeling, every ambiguous text, it all clicked into place, forming a complete, monstrous picture. The forgotten promises, the late nights, Melanie's lingering presence, her knowing smiles. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a calculated, prolonged deception. They had orchestrated this, together, behind my back, while I was blissfully, ignorantly planning a future with a man who was already building one with my sister. I didn't cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside me, trapped by the sheer magnitude of the shock. My body felt numb, disconnected. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sirens from the street below, but they seemed to belong to another world, one that continued to exist while mine had imploded. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The man I had loved, the man I had planned my life with, was a phantom, replaced by this cold, indifferent figure. The betrayal was so absolute, it erased everything, every memory, every shared moment, tainting it with the bitter taste of lies. I was at rock bottom, stripped bare, hollowed out. There was nothing left but a gaping wound where my heart used to be, and the suffocating silence of a world that had suddenly gone dark. The days that followed the shatter moment were a blur of muted pain. I moved through the apartment like a ghost, the silence amplifying the echo of Damien's casual cruelty. He stayed, for a few days, in a strange limbo, as if waiting for me to pack his bags, to make the first move. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, not by despair, but by a chilling clarity that began to settle over me. There was no anger, not the explosive kind, no screaming fits or thrown objects. Just a profound, quiet devastation that coiled itself around my insides. It was a cold, hard knot that slowly, agonizingly, began to unravel into a singular, unwavering resolve. I watched them. Not overtly, not in a way that would reveal my knowledge. I observed. I noticed the subtle glances they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking, the hushed phone calls Melanie would take just outside the apartment door. My grief was a shield, a cloak of invisibility. No one expects a broken woman to be observing, to be strategizing. They expect tears, histrionics, a dramatic collapse. I gave them none of it. I ate little, slept less, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. The silence that had once suffocated me now became my ally, a vast, empty canvas on which I began to paint my new reality. The first step was to detach. Emotionally. Physically. I stopped engaging. When Damien tried to make small talk, his voice laced with an uncomfortable politeness, I offered monosyllabic replies. When Melanie called, her voice cloyingly sweet, full of feigned concern, I let her prattle on, offering only vague affirmations. They mistook my silence for weakness, for acceptance, for a woman broken beyond repair. And that was exactly what I wanted them to believe. I started small. I began to collect evidence. Not for revenge, not in the traditional sense, but for self-preservation. For liberation. I retrieved Damien's phone again, this time with a calmer, more calculated precision. I took screenshots of every damning text message, every illicit photo. I meticulously documented dates, times, and content, creating a digital dossier of their betrayal. I found emails, subtle references in their work conversations that hinted at their growing intimacy, their shared secrets. I wasn't driven by rage, but by a quiet, fierce determination to understand, to document, to ensure that if ever there came a moment where I needed to protect myself, I would have the undeniable truth. My focus shifted inward. The external world, once so vibrant and full of promise, had receded into a dull background hum. I started walking. Long, solitary walks through the city, the cold wind biting at my cheeks, but the physical exertion a welcome distraction from the turmoil within. I walked until my feet ached, until my mind felt clear, until the sheer exhaustion brought a temporary reprieve from the relentless ache in my chest. During these walks, I didn't dwell on the pain. I planned. I envisioned. I began to see myself not as a victim, but as an agent of change. I started researching. Not about how to win someone back, or how to seek legal retribution. My research was about understanding the intricacies of their world, the business dealings Damien was involved in, the social circles Melanie cultivated. I knew their vulnerabilities. Damien's reputation, his meticulously crafted image of integrity and success. Melanie's desperate need for external validation, her carefully constructed facade of perfection. These weren't targets for destruction, but elements of a complex puzzle, and I was learning how all the pieces fit together. I sought out a therapist. Not to wallow, but to process, to untangle the knotted mess of emotions. She was a quiet, astute woman who listened more than she spoke. "It's okay to feel this," she'd say, her voice calm. "But you don't have to stay here." She helped me see that the pain, while real, was not my identity. That healing wasn't about erasing the past, but about integrating it, transforming it into strength. I started working out. Not in a frantic, desperate attempt to reclaim my body, but with a quiet, disciplined resolve. The gym became a sanctuary, the rhythmic thump of my running shoes on the treadmill a meditative mantra. Each bead of sweat was a small victory, each lifted weight a testament to my burgeoning strength, both physical and emotional. I was rebuilding, brick by brick, not the life I had lost, but a new one, stronger, more resilient. My transformation was an internal one, unseen by those who had wounded me. I spoke little, but I listened intently. I observed everything. I practiced stillness, an almost meditative detachment from the storm brewing around me. My quietness was not weakness, it was a gathering of power. I was like a forest after a fire, seemingly desolate, but beneath the scorched earth, new roots were already taking hold, drawing strength from the very ashes of destruction. I was preparing myself, not for a battle, but for a new chapter, a chapter where I was no longer a pawn in someone else's game, but the master of my own destiny. The quiet planning was done. The seeds were sown. Now, I just had to wait for them to bloom. The moment arrived with an almost theatrical subtlety, a whisper before the roar. It wasn't a grand confrontation, but a series of precise, calculated moves, each one designed to shift the balance of power, to peel back the layers of their carefully constructed lies. I had waited, patiently, for the perfect opening. And it came, not in a moment of my choosing, but when their arrogance finally tripped them up. Damien, ever the man of grand gestures, decided to host a lavish charity gala. It was meant to be his crowning achievement, a public display of his influence and impeccable reputation. Melanie, of course, was by his side, beaming, playing the role of the devoted fiancé, draped in a dress that looked suspiciously like a custom piece I had once admired. The irony was a bitter taste on my tongue. I didn't attend the gala. My presence there would have been seen as desperate, a woman clinging to a past that had rejected her. Instead, I sent a gift. An anonymous, carefully chosen gift, delivered to the event organizer with instructions to place it prominently on the auction table. It was a framed, enlarged photograph. A candid shot, taken years ago, during a summer vacation Damien and I had taken to Italy. It showed us laughing hand in hand, strolling through a sun-drenched piazza. A simple, innocuous image to most. But to Damien, and especially to Melanie, it was a silent, chilling reminder of the life they had stolen. The whispers started almost immediately. I heard it from a mutual acquaintance who was at the gala, relaying the details with a breathless excitement. Everyone was talking about it, Camille. That photo, right there on the table. Damien looked absolutely furious, and Melanie, well, she practically turned green. The satisfaction was a quiet hum beneath my skin. It wasn't about public humiliation, not yet. It was about planting a seed of unease, a subtle tremor in their carefully controlled world. The true turning point, however, came unexpectedly from an unlikely source. A week after the gala, I received an anonymous email. It contained a single unadorned attachment, an audio file. I downloaded it, my hands trembling slightly, and pressed play. It was a recording, clear as a bell, of a phone conversation between Melanie and Damien. They were arguing, their voices low and sharp, about money, about a business deal that had gone sour, a secret investment Damien had made using funds he wasn't supposed to touch. Melanie was accusing him of recklessness, of jeopardizing their future. And then, a chilling confession from Damien himself. Look, I told you I had to cover my tracks. Camille was getting suspicious. I had to make sure she was completely out of the picture before I made that move. My breath hitched. My entire body went cold. It wasn't just about their affair. It was about a calculated financial maneuver, a deliberate act to ensure my downfall, to remove me as a potential obstacle. The betrayal now had a cold, hard, financial edge. This wasn't just emotional devastation, it was systematic dismantling. And then, a crack in Melanie's voice. But what if she finds out about everything? About the trust. The trust. My grandmother's legacy. A small, but significant, sum that was meant to be released to me on my 40th birthday. A sum that, I now realized with a jolt of horror, Damien had been subtly, expertly trying to gain control of for months leading up to our engagement. He had even convinced me to give him limited power of attorney for financial planning purposes. The depth of their deception, the sheer, ruthless premeditation of it, made my stomach clench. I listened to the recording again and again until every inflection, every word, was etched into my memory. This was it. This was the piece of evidence that changed everything. It wasn't just about my broken heart anymore. It was about their calculated attempt to dismantle my future, financially and emotionally. My quiet planning had led to this. I didn't need an ally. The betrayer himself had provided the weapon. I consulted a lawyer, a quiet, sharp woman recommended by my therapist. I played her the recording. Her expression remained impassive, but her eyes held a steely glint. This, she said, her voice low, changes everything. This isn't just a breach of trust. This is fraud. Potentially criminal. The power began to shift then. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, undeniable click. I instructed my lawyer to send a discreet but firm letter to Damien, outlining the evidence I possessed, detailing the financial implications of his actions and demanding the immediate return of any funds or assets he had attempted to manipulate. There was no aggression in the letter, no emotional language. Just cold, hard facts. It was a legal document, but it was also a declaration. I was no longer a victim. I was a force. Damien's response was immediate and frantic. He called, leaving voicemail after voicemail, his voice cracking, laced with a fear I had never heard before. He was unraveling. Melanie, too, started sending texts, desperate, confused. "Camille, what is this? What have you done?" They didn't understand how I knew, how I had gathered such damning evidence. They were too self-absorbed, too confident in their deceit, to imagine that the silent, broken woman they had dismissed was quietly, meticulously, dismantling their world. The turn was complete. The hunter had become the hunted, and they didn't even know what was happening until it was too late. The quiet revenge had begun, and the sense of satisfaction that permeated me was not vengeful, but deeply, profoundly empowering. The unraveling of Damien and Melanie's world began not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing crawl, like a carefully stitched garment coming apart thread by thread. The initial legal letter, so precise and devoid of emotion, had thrown a wrench into Damien's meticulously crafted image of success. Suddenly, his business partners were asking questions. His investors became wary. The vague rumors of personal issues escalated into pointed inquiries about his financial ethics. The tight-lipped silence from his lawyer only fueled the speculation. His social circles, once so eager to embrace him, began to subtly distance themselves. The whispers started in hushed tones at exclusive events, then grew louder, becoming the background hum of his once charmed existence. Melanie, always dependent on external validation, felt the shift acutely. Her social media posts, once brimming with curated perfection, grew more sporadic, their cheerfulness forced. The stream of invitations to elite parties and exclusive events dwindled. Friends, sensing the impending scandal, started to make excuses, their once effusive greetings turning cool and distant. She started calling me, frantic, bewildered. "Camille, what's happening? Why is everyone so weird? Damien is losing it." She still didn't grasp the full extent of the truth, didn't connect her betrayal with the quiet, inexorable crumbling of their joint reality. She saw only the consequences, not the cause. I watched not with glee, but with a detached observer's eye. This wasn't about revenge, not truly. It was about restoration. About setting right what had been so cruelly twisted. The legal process was slow, arduous, but my lawyer was relentless. We meticulously presented the evidence, the recorded conversations, the financial documents, the paper trail of Damien's manipulations. He tried to fight back, to obfuscate, to paint me as a jilted ex, but the truth was too stark, too undeniable. The trust, my grandmother's legacy, was eventually returned, along with a significant sum to cover damages. It wasn't a windfall, but it was a tangible reclamation of what had been stolen, a physical manifestation of my rising. My healing wasn't linear. There were days when the raw wound of betrayal would ache with a phantom pain, moments when the memories would flash before my eyes, sharp and vivid. But these moments became less frequent, less intense. I had stopped trying to erase the past. Instead, I was learning to integrate it, to understand how it had shaped me, hardened me, even as it had broken me. The process of reclaiming my peace was a daily practice. I continued my walks, but now they were imbued with a different energy. They were no longer about numbing the pain, but about connecting with the rhythm of the city, with the quiet strength of my own 2 feet carrying me forward. I found joy in small things again, the first sip of hot coffee in the morning, the vibrant colors of a sunset over the river, the comforting weight of a good book in my hands. I started painting again, a hobby I had abandoned years ago. My canvases were no longer dark and brooding, but filled with vibrant hues, abstract shapes that spoke of resilience and rebirth. Andrew was a constant, gentle presence throughout this period. He never pushed, never demanded, never sought explanations. He simply was. He listened without judgment, offered comfort without pity, and understood without words. His love was a steady anchor, a quiet affirmation of my worth, independent of any external validation. He showed me what true partnership looked like, not about grand gestures, but about unwavering support, about seeing and loving the whole person, flaws and all. With him, I learned to trust again, slowly, painstakingly. It wasn't about forgetting the pain of betrayal, but about learning that not everyone was capable of such cruelty, that genuine connection was possible. Damien's career ultimately imploded. The legal battles, the public scrutiny, the erosion of his reputation, it was too much for him to withstand. He lost his business, his prestigious connections, and eventually, his apartment. He faded from the public eye, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones in the circles he once dominated. Melanie, stripped of her carefully constructed social standing and financial security, was left adrift. She had built her life on a foundation of borrowed glamour and stolen happiness, and when that foundation crumbled, there was nothing left. I heard she eventually moved back to our hometown, a shadow of her former self, working a quiet, unremarkable job, her once sparkling eyes dulled by a bitter resentment. I didn't gloat. I felt no triumph in their downfall. Their consequences were their own. My focus was on my own rise. I started a small consulting business, leveraging my years of experience in project management. It was slow going at first, but I poured my heart into it, building it brick by painstaking brick on a foundation of integrity and hard work. There was an immense satisfaction in creating something entirely my own, something that no one could ever take from me. The healing was a multifaceted process. It involved grieving the loss of my old self, the naive, trusting woman I had been. It involved acknowledging the immense pain, sitting with it, and letting it pass through me rather than allowing it to consume me. It involved forgiveness, not for them, but for myself, for blaming myself, for believing I was somehow responsible for their choices. It was about recognizing my own strength, my own resilience, the fierce, quiet power that had emerged from the ashes of my despair. I learned that healing wasn't about erasing the scars, but about understanding that they were proof of my survival, of my ability to endure and to grow stronger. The world had shifted, certainly, but I had shifted with it, morphing into a woman who was clearer, more resolute, and profoundly, beautifully free. I stood on the porch of our small cottage upstate, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The dog, a golden retriever with a perpetually goofy grin, nudged my hand, demanding attention. Andrew was inside, humming softly as he chopped firewood. My life now was a symphony of quiet moments, of deep roots and clear skies. I wasn't the same person I was before the betrayal, and I never would be. The experience had carved new lines into my soul, etched a map of resilience and caution onto my heart. But those lines weren't scars of bitterness, they were contours of strength. I didn't forgive them, not in the traditional sense of absolving them of their actions. Forgiveness, for me, wasn't a door I opened for them. It was a window I opened for myself, just to finally breathe. I understood that their choices stemmed from their own insecurities, their own deficiencies. Their betrayal was a reflection of them, not of me. Holding on to anger, to resentment, would have been like drinking poison and expecting them to die. I chose instead to let it go, not out of magnanimity, but out of a fierce desire for my own peace. The bitterness, the stinging injustice, had long since faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. I saw the experience now not as a punishment, but as a crucible. It had stripped away my illusions, forced me to confront my own vulnerabilities, and ultimately, revealed a reservoir of strength I never knew I possessed. I had learned to discern true intentions, to trust my gut, to value authenticity over superficial charm. My relationships with Andrew, with my chosen family of friends, were built on solid ground, on mutual respect and unwavering honesty. When I thought of Damien and Melanie now, it was with a detached sense of reality. They were part of a past narrative, a chapter that had closed, its pages turned. Their consequences were their own burden to bear, and I harbored no desire to witness their struggles or to celebrate their misfortune. My energy was directed forward, towards building, creating, living a life that was deeply, profoundly mine. The sound of Andrew's axe striking would echo through the quiet forest. It was a rhythmic, comforting sound, a testament to the life we were building together. Our home wasn't grand, but it was filled with warmth, with laughter, with a profound sense of belonging. The small herb garden on the windowsill, now thriving, was a daily reminder of resilience, of life finding a way to flourish even after destruction. I was free, not just from the shadow of betrayal, but from the need for external validation, from the fear of being alone, from the naive belief that happiness was something found in another person. I had found it within myself, nurtured it, cultivated it through the dark years, and now it bloomed, bright and unwavering. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air grew cooler, and I pulled my cardigan tighter. I breathed in the scent of wood smoke, of damp earth, of coming home. It was a homecoming not just to a physical place, but to myself. Whole, scarred, but irrevocably strong. Have you found your way back from betrayal?